Welcome back to Spider Red. We'll get into the top 25 going into week 12. Just to give a little quick update on week 11. The two big games really didn't live up to their billings. One team got destroyed. One team did exactly what they did against another top team. I will get in both of those games more on the two teams that won. There were a few upsets, so there are a few changes in the top 25. Two teams fell out. We'll discuss that at the end. And then we'll always go into our top 12 bracket that we're looking for next year. So let's get started. Falling back into my top 12, we have the Oregon State Beavers. They had a big win over Stanford. They easily won that game 62-17 over the weekend. I have them moving back in the top 12 because they have a good win against Utah, a good win against UCLA, even though the UCLA is kind of diminishing just a little bit. Both of their losses were only by 3 points. Arizona beat them 27-24. Washington State earlier in the season beat them 38-35. They have a big matchup against number 5 Washington this week, and then the following week they play their in-state rival, the Oregon Ducks. Quarterback DJ is playing so well, and they have that running back that just had an incredible game over the weekend, and he's actually going to be my star player for that game, Damian Martinez. He wears number 8. He had 146 yards rushing with 4 touchdowns against Stanford. A very impressive showing in that game. So I have Oregon State falling back in, and we'll move on to number 11. At number 11, I have the Oklahoma Sooners. They're moving back in the top 12. They had those 2 close losses in back-to-back weeks against Kansas and Oklahoma State. They had a huge comeback win against West Virginia. Dylan Gabriel put on a show. He is my MVP for their team this weekend. He had 423 yards passing with 5 touchdowns and 50 yards rushing with 3 touchdowns. He had 8 total TDs in one game. Some kids don't have that throughout their whole year. He was able to contribute 8 TDs in that game against West Virginia. Oklahoma's going to need some help to make it back to the Big 12 championship. There are 4 teams stuck at that 5-2 record in the Big 12. The biggest thing, though, is they're going to need Oklahoma State to stumble against Houston or BYU in the next few weeks because Oklahoma State holds that tiebreaker. At this point, it really doesn't matter what the other 2 teams do because they hold the tiebreaker to them, but Oklahoma State's going to have to stumble. And after what happened to Oklahoma State this weekend, it could be a good possibility that that could happen. Oklahoma will need to take care of business against BYU themselves and TCU at the end of their regular season. I think they can do it. Either way, I really hope that Oklahoma or Kansas State makes it to the Big 12 because they played Texas so well. So that leaves Oklahoma at number 11. Let's move on. Staying at number 10, I have the Louisville Cardinals. They had a tough matchup on Thursday night against Virginia, and they came out winning 24-17. They controlled their own destiny here. They play Miami and Kentucky to finish the season. Miami lost their quarterback that was doing pretty well against Florida State. I'm not sure he's going to come back. Looks like he might have broke his wrist, and that leaves Miami with Van Dyke, who's been a turnover machine at the quarterback position. This will give Louisville a very good shot of winning that game. If they beat Miami, that will guarantee them a spot against Florida State in the ACC championship game. And both teams need it. Florida State needs it to have another good matchup to keep them in the position for a college football playoff. And Louisville could use that to boost their chance of getting into the college football playoff. They still got to get past. Louisville still has to get past Miami and Kentucky. The player of the game I had for Louisville is Ashton Galat. He is their defensive lineman number 9. He had 7 tackles with 1.5 sacks. So I have Louisville staying at number 10, and we'll move on to number 9. Moving up to number 9, I have the Missouri Tigers. They manhandled Tennessee over the weekend with a 36-7 win, and their running back should be in the Heisman conversation. I will talk about him during the player of the game. Unfortunately, Missouri's not going to have a shot at making the SEC championship. This is a huge building season for them going forward. Drinkwitz is a good coach. They've been recruiting very well. He's been using the portal very well. That's how he finally found this running back. Moving forward, Missouri's going to be a force in the SEC. The SEC is removing their divisions. There's not going to be an East or West next year. They have 2 guaranteed to maybe 3 guaranteed games each year with some of the rivals that they have built. But watch out, SEC. Missouri's starting to look very well. And hopefully they can finish their season. They have Florida at home this week, and then they go to Arkansas. That's their last 2 games. Maybe they will finish out and have a shot at getting a New Year's Bowl game. Their player of the game, and this is a kid I think everyone should be talking about for the Heisman, is Cody Schrader. He's number 7. He was actually my player of the game last week. He had 35 carries for 205 yards of rushing with 5 catches for 116 yards receiving and 1 touchdown against Tennessee. I hope they don't force that kid to practice this week and let him rest before playing Florida. So congrats to Cody on an incredible game. If you look down at the bottom at quality wins, they still have the 24 Kentucky. That win's diminishing a little bit. Kansas State and Tennessee are still good wins. So that's who I have at number 9, and we'll continue to move on. So at number 8, I have the Oregon Ducks. They had another solid win against USC. We always know that with Caleb Williams, USC can put up a lot of points. They took care of business. They kind of let them come back a little bit in the second half. But in the end, Oregon was still just too much. And Bo Nix keeps polishing his resume for the Heisman. I'm going to go ahead and go down to quality wins to explain my reasoning of keeping them here. Their only 2 wins right now is when Colorado fell to 19. And due to the hype, I'm still keeping that as a quality win because when Oregon went into that game, everyone was talking about Colorado. It's Colorado, Deion, the Buffaloes doing this. Oregon went in there and pretty much destroyed Colorado. Didn't pretty much. They destroyed Colorado. And then they took care of business against Utah. They still barely lost against Washington. Going back to their last 2 remaining games, the Pac-12 championship is still in the air. Washington hasn't lost a game, but they still have 2 games, just like Oregon. Oregon's only got the 1 loss to Washington. They both play Oregon State. Washington this week, Oregon the following week. There's just too much football left to determine who is going to play in the Pac-12 championship. Let's move on to their MVP over the weekend. I have Evan Williams, their defensive back, number 33. He had 9 tackles, a sack, and a fumble recovery. I know Bo Nix threw for 400 yards. We all know who Bo Nix is, so that's why I wanted to give a different MVP this week. So that's why I have Oregon State at number 8, and we'll move on to number 7. So at number 7, I have the Alabama Crimson Tide. I started watching a little bit of the Kentucky and Alabama game. Alabama took off. They really controlled the game from the start. They had such a stranglehold on them. I didn't watch much of the rest of the game, and I just went back and looked at highlights. Milroe continues to carry that offense. If you can shut him down, contain those legs, follow Texas' game plan by spying him, if you can contain him from not being able to run, I think you have a really good shot of beating Alabama. But right now, they have Chattanooga and Auburn left, and then they have already clinched a spot to play Georgia in the SEC. Georgia's clinched the East side, and that's going to determine who goes to the college football playoff. Because I think with Oregon and Washington, either one of them would get in. Michigan, Ohio State, that's 1, 2. You got Florida State left, 3, and then that would leave Georgia or Alabama as that 4 spot. The only way they could both get in is if Washington or Oregon lose 1 more, Washington has to lose 2, or Michigan, Ohio State loses 2 somehow, and I don't see that happening because then you still have Florida State in the mix. There's a lot of football to play, like I said earlier, but I think the SEC championship is going to determine which SEC team goes to the college football playoff. Real quick, Alabama's quality wins, they're all the same. All 3 of those teams are still in the top 25 right now. The player of the game I had for this past game is Terrion Arnold. He's a defensive back, number 3. He had 4 tackles and a sack. The defense played really well against Kentucky. But right now, Alabama is staying at number 7. Moving on to number 6, I have the Texas Longhorns. They survived TCU. They were up 26-6 at the end of the third quarter. TCU scored 20 points in the fourth to make it a close game. Texas kicked 1 field goal in the fourth quarter, and Texas won 29-26. So it seems like they kind of shut everything down and allowed TCU to kind of stay in the game. Outside of that, Texas is the only team in the Big 12 that controls their own destiny for a chance at the Big 12 championship. So currently, there are 4 other teams with 2 losses in the conference. You have Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, Iowa State, and Kansas State. So they're going to have to get help from each other to kind of get in that spot. Now, there's still a long shot. There's still 3 other teams that have 3 losses in the conference. That if these teams, they all kind of play each other at the end. West Virginia, Texas Tech, and Kansas only have 3 losses. They could kind of find their way into the championship game too. So the next 2 weeks for the Big 12 is going to be very important on who goes to the Big 12 conference championship. And to me, it's going to come down to Texas because the other teams have too many losses. If Texas wins their last 2 games against Iowa State and Texas Tech, both of them still trying to fight for a spot, they will have a shot at the Big 12 championship in the college football playoff. But they have to win out all three games. They got to beat Iowa State, Texas Tech, and then they got to win the Big 12 championship to even have a shot at the college football playoff. Because like I said, it's getting crowded at the top. 4 quality wins for Texas. I still have one of the best wins right now in college football, and that was when they beat Alabama, and they beat them in Alabama. Kansas is still hanging in the top 25, and Kansas State has moved up in the top 25. So all 3 of their wins is giving them a better strength of schedule, putting Texas ahead of Alabama because they beat them straight up. But that's why I keep moving Oregon down, is because Texas' resume, they played more quality teams and beat them, and that's why I have them at number 6. Their player of the game over the weekend for me was Xavier Worthy. He's their wide receiver, wears number 1. He had 10 catches for 137 yards versus TCU. Texas will remain at number 6. At number 5, I have the Michigan Wolverines. No Harbaugh, no problem. They beat Penn State and did not have to throw a single pass in the second half. It was pretty ridiculous. Harbaugh is still suspended from being able to coach at the games. He can coach during the week. But what they did against Penn State, they kind of rallied behind their coach, which everybody thought they would. But let's go back to what I just said. They ran 32 straight plays, and I'm going to go ahead and mention my MVP, and that's that O-line. They ran 32 straight runs in the entire second half, and Penn State couldn't stop them with this elite defense. Well, another problem was Penn State's defense was getting so much pass rush that J.J. McCarthy couldn't do anything. So they just went to what was working, and that was running the ball. I don't think the score indicated how much they dominated. They beat Penn State 24-15, and Penn State scored late just like Ohio State. But the game was so similar to Ohio State. Ohio State pretty much controlled all the game, and then they gave up a late touchdown. Michigan was the same way. So for Michigan's next 3 games, they have Maryland, and then they have the big game against Ohio State. And like I said with the SEC, this game is going to determine if the Big Ten gets someone in. Ohio State and Michigan cannot stumble this week with their games before the big game. But whoever wins this game is going to the Big Ten championship and should have an easy time with. It's probably going to be Iowa. Iowa has 0 offense, and both the Michigan and Ohio State's defense is good enough to shut them down. So this is Michigan's first quality win, and I know it's against a top 10 team, but all the teams in front of them have more quality wins, and that's why I still have Michigan at number 5. Of course, if they beat Ohio State, I'm going to start moving them up for sure, but they just hadn't played enough people, and that's why they remain in that spot at number 5. At number 4, I have the Ohio State Buckeyes. I know they keep moving down my list. It's purely about resume. The Big Ten just doesn't have enough quality teams this year to propel them to the front. Ohio State has the Notre Dame win, which puts them ahead of Michigan, but both of them have the Penn State game. It was almost the exact same game. Penn State didn't have enough offense against both of their good defenses. It's going to come down to Ohio State nor Michigan can stumble against their games this week. Michigan has Maryland and Ohio State has Minnesota. They both need to take care of business, get to the big game, because the big game winner is going to propel them to the college football playoff. Because there's no team, I mentioned it last with Michigan, it doesn't matter if it's Iowa, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Northwest, whoever makes it, both of those teams are talented enough that they should easily win the Big Ten championship, and it should put them into the college football playoff. So for the player of the game for Ohio State this past weekend, I have Sonny Styles. He's a safety, number 6. He had 3 tackles and a sack, and this kid is 6'4", 230 for a safety. That's a big safety. That's why I have Ohio State dropping into the 4th spot. Ohio State will probably remain here until in 2 weeks for the big game. At number 3, I have the Florida State Seminoles. It was a fun game against Miami on Saturday, but it was one of the worst officiated games I have seen in a very long time. And I'm going to have to agree with one of my friends that Keon Coleman might be one of the most complete wide receivers in all of college football, even going up as high to Marvin Harrison Jr. Going to Florida State, I have them ranked 3 just because I think their resume speaks a little more than even Ohio State. Why? Because Florida State beat LSU, and I think LSU is a better football team than Penn State if you look at their resumes. LSU has beaten a few top 25 teams where Penn State has only one, and that was Iowa. It's just that right now Penn State has less losses than LSU. But comparing together, I think LSU is a better win than Penn State. Florida State's other win is Duke. I know that's diminishing a little bit. Ohio State's one of their better wins is against Notre Dame. We saw the Duke and Notre Dame game. It was very even until the very end of the game. I think if Duke didn't lose that quarterback, Duke probably could have had a chance to beat Notre Dame as well. So that's 2 evenly matched teams. I just think the ACC has better teams this year overall than the Big Ten. Florida State had to beat Clemson too, and Clemson's still a good football team. If you go down Ohio State, I just don't see anything. Maybe Maryland, but I would put Clemson up against Maryland too. And that's why I think the resumes for Florida State just speaks more than Ohio State. And that's why I'm putting Florida State at number 3. Florida State has already clinched a berth in the ACC championship. This week they have North Alabama, and then the following week they go to the Swamp at Florida. I think they'll win both games. I don't see them stumbling even against their heavy rival in Florida. So right now I see them going to the ACC championship, and then I really hope that Louisville wins out and they get to play each other. And I think Florida State, they're going to need that, like I've been mentioning. So their player of the game this past weekend, I give it to Trey Benson, the running back number 3. He had 80 yards rushing with 2 touchdowns against Miami. That's who I have at number 3 is Florida State. Let's go on to number 2. At number 2, I have the Georgia Bulldogs. I want to do the chant so bad, so here it goes. What's that coming down the track? It's the mean machine of the red and black. The Dogs are moving up. They killed Ole Miss, destroyed Ole Miss this weekend. A huge 52-17 win. They only punted the ball once, and it was the impressive win that Georgia needs to keep moving up or deserve that number 1 ranking through the AP ranks. So Georgia has already clinched their position in the SEC championship. But as I mentioned with Alabama, Georgia, like a lot of teams, they can't stumble. They still have to go to Knoxville to Neyland Stadium and play Tennessee this weekend. That's another top 25 matchup. I know Tennessee is falling because of their big loss to Missouri, but they're still a top 25 team. And that could give Georgia 4 top 25 wins going to Georgia Tech. They'll need to take care of the Ramblin' Wreck, and then on to the SEC championship against Alabama. And then if they can beat Alabama, that would give them 5 top 25 matchups. 5 top 25 wins. Even though that Kentucky win is diminishing a little bit, with them getting destroyed win by Georgia and Alabama. I guess it just shows how good their teams are, but Kentucky's kind of coming down. But the Missouri and Ole Miss wins are huge for Georgia. Their player of the game is C.J. Allen. He's a true freshman. He's been playing due to a lot of injuries that we've had. He actually led the team in tackles against Ole Miss with 9, and he had a sack. That's why Georgia's resume just keeps improving every week. They're going through this gauntlet. They got one more game against Tennessee. They really shouldn't struggle against Georgia Tech, but these are both away games, and hopefully they can win both of those and go into the SEC undefeated. But that's why I have them at number 2. Staying at number 1 is the Washington Huskies. They had a big win against Utah. Like Georgia, they are running a gauntlet right now. They played USC the week before. They played Utah this week. They were actually down at halftime, and they didn't let Utah score at all in the second half, and they were able to score 11 points and win 35-28. So I'm going to explain why I think Washington should be over Georgia right now. Both of them have 3 quality wins. For Washington, they have the win over Oregon, the win over USC, and the win over Utah. So if we compare real quick, USC is similar to the Kentucky game for Georgia. Utah could be similar to the Missouri win. So I think Missouri's a little better than Utah, actually a lot better, but still, I mean, they're kind of in that same range. And then Georgia has the Ole Miss win, which I don't think Ole Miss has much defense, kind of like USC. But the kicker for me is the Oregon game. Oregon, I honestly think they are one of the best. I mean, they didn't have the loss against Washington. They would be towards the top. Dan Lanning has Oregon playing very well. But the Oregon win for me, it is a top 10 win. And the Oregon top 10 win to me is higher than Georgia's top 10 win against Ole Miss. I would put Oregon over Ole Miss right now if they were to play each other. Utah, Missouri, I'd probably give it to Missouri. USC, Kentucky, I'd probably give it to USC. So that's what I'm saying. It kind of balances out, but I still think the Oregon win is higher than Georgia, and that's why I have them there. Washington hasn't clinched a spot in the Pac-12 championship yet. They still have 2 pretty decent games. I mean, the Oregon State game is the game of the week for me. That is a huge game. I mean, that could propel Oregon State in the championship, but Washington would have to lose against Washington State, and Oregon would have to lose one of their 2 games. Oregon State still needs some help, but if Washington takes care of these next 2 games, they'll clinch that spot in the Pac-12, and then they'll have a really good shot of making the college football playoff, and they'll probably play Oregon again, and that would be great because that first time they played together was a great game. So Washington, they control their own destiny like a few other teams. If they win out, they get to go to that Pac-12 championship, and then they'll have a chance to play whoever's going to be there, beat them, and get into the college football playoff. My MVP has a little asterisk to it, but I think he still played really well. Alfonso Tuputala. He is a linebacker number 11. He had 4 tackles. He had this interception. He was going 76 yards. He had it, but he let go of the ball a few yards ahead of the end zone, so they counted it as a fumble, and Utah got the ball at I think it was the 1 yard line. Come on, Alfonso, man. Hold on to that ball. Go 5-6 yards into the end zone and then drop it. We've seen this happen a few times, but I still think he played a great game. And they had the game against Utah. I know the score kind of didn't show it. Utah was playing very well in the first half. And then Washington just came down and locked down the game in the second half to win. So there it is. That's my top 12. I still have Washington at the top. We have a lot of football left in the last 2 weeks of the regular season. And then we have a few championships to worry about. So let's move on to the rest. Let's look at the rest of the top 25, starting off at 13, Penn State. So they have 2 losses now. Their only 2 losses are, number 4 and 5 for me, Ohio State and Michigan. They do have a top 25 win against Iowa, but that's barely a top 25 win for me. I know Ole Miss has 2 wins with LSU and Tulane. Their performance against Georgia and Alabama, I would give Penn State's performance against their 2 top teams more than I would Ole Miss. So that's why I have Penn State over Ole Miss. Next, I have the two undefeated teams in Division I that remain, and that's Liberty and James Madison. The Dukes of James Madison actually has College Game Day coming to them this week, which I think is really cool. So I have those two schools at 15 and 16, and I hope they give James Madison a bowl game, and I hope that bowl game is against Liberty. That would be a fun game to watch. At 17, I have Arizona. I know they're a 3-loss team, and there are a few 2-loss teams below them, but Arizona's actually beat a few top 25 teams. They played 5 straight top 25 games, and that's why I have them ranked. Their resume just shows more. North Carolina's at 18. They only have one top 25 win, and that's against Miami, but they do have a top 5 offense. I have LSU coming in at 19. They have the one top 25 win, and their 3 losses against all ranked teams. Kansas State comes in at 20. They actually haven't beat a top 25 team yet, but I put them over Iowa because Iowa hadn't beat a top 25 team either, and they have the worst offense in all of college football. They are very, very last. It's kind of difficult for me to even put them in the top 25, but they only have 2 losses. They've been winning the games. Their defense has been playing well, so I'm going to give them a ranking of 21. At 22, I have Utah. They lost their game this past week to Washington, but they do have a few top 25 wins, and actually I put them over Notre Dame. I know Notre Dame has them too. Utah has played better teams overall than Notre Dame, and that's why I'm putting Utah over Notre Dame. And then I have Tulane. They only have the 1 loss. If they went undefeated, I'd put them up there towards Liberty and James Madison. They did play Ole Miss very well, but now that's not looking so good, especially after how bad Georgia beat Ole Miss. And then remaining in the top 25, I have Kansas with their loss to Texas Tech, but I still think they're one of the better 3-loss teams. Falling out of the top 25, I have Tennessee. Tennessee hasn't beat a top 25 team. Man, Missouri just made them look really bad. They play Georgia this week. At least it's a home game. Maybe the crowd can keep them in the game for a little bit. I have them falling out. Man, I was talking good about Oklahoma State, and then they go and get beat 45-3 by UCF. And earlier in the season, they lost to South Alabama 33-7. So they've had 2 huge letdown games. So I have them coming completely out of the top 25. There it is. There's the top 25 going into week 12. So let's look at the bracket. This would be next year's bracket with the 12-team playoff. College football is going to try to get a 5+7 introduced. I'm not sure how the 5, I don't know which the 5th one they would consider. With the Pac-2 is going to be left. I believe they said that the conference would have to have, a certain amount of teams in the conference. So really it should be a 4+8. But anyway, maybe the Pac-12 brings in the Mountain West or brings in a combination of teams to reach that. So I'm not sure right now. But anyway, let's look at this bracket real quick. We have number 1 Washington. They would play the winner of number 8 Oregon or 9 Missouri. And then Ohio State would play the winner of 5 Michigan or 12 Oregon State. And then on the right-hand side at the top, we have the 3-seed Florida State would play the winner of Oklahoma and Texas, that 11-6. And then going down, we would have the 10-7 game, which would be Louisville versus Alabama. And that winner would play Georgia, the 2-seed. So that would be your bracket that we would see next year if a 4+8 or something similar is given to that. If not, that 12 team, which would be Oregon State, would be replaced by either Tulane or Liberty or James Madison. It would depend. There's the bracket. Thank you for listening to Spider Red. Tell somebody you love them. Later.